So I welcome all the panelists and all those participants who are joining us. This session is focused on sports as a nation building and stimulus for mixed youth development. And obviously we've worked in partnership with Buchenmann and Partners to put this session together. The session will be presented and moderated by Bob van Bebe, Director, Buchenmann and Partners Architects. And the panel joining us today will be Kyle Schofield, Director, QA Venue Solutions, and James Hamilton, Director, Global Host Cities and Sports Venues, Turner & Townsend. So we look forward to the session. And Bob, I believe you'll be starting off with the presentation. So I'll hand it over to you from here.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Just wanting to share my screen. Can that be seen by everyone?
Not yet. We cannot see it yet.
Apologies.
There we go. We can now see your screen, Bob. I think you just need to choose, yeah, and then just if you can go full screen, and then we're good to go.
So is everyone seeing that full?
Yeah, we can see it. We just need to go full screen.
There we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. The topic: sports infrastructure as a catalyst for urban development. My previous role was involved in the Soccer City Stadium, and as a kind of large sporting event, that was an opportunity to talk about the ideas of nation building and infrastructure development going forward. And those of you that remember the World Cup and the opening game, this is the shot of South African player Simphiwe Tshabalala shooting and scoring the first goal of the World Cup. And those that were part of that event will remember the amazing kind of feeling that went through the entire country around nation building. And obviously the event as an opportunity to create that nation building and investment in infrastructure was hugely successful before, during, and immediately after the event. And the emotions ran extremely high. And it is no secret that that these kind of massive events create that kind of opportunity for nation building and bringing people together around the success of a sports event, but more importantly around the success of obviously a host nation's team. Around the idea of nation building, one also has the principle of the aesthetics, and what is it that the building says, and what kind of message does the infrastructure send, and how do people kind of resonate with what the idea behind this building actually is. And so around Soccer City, where the FIFA World Cup for 2010 was primarily marketed as an event for the African continent, one needed to find speaks to that. And I think the idea of the calabash or the bowl, which is shared around, and the sharing of a drink or the sharing of coming together and sharing an experience around food and drink, is very common throughout the African continent. And the kind of idea that this thing that talks to that sort of story and bringing people together in the South African context, it was around many people in Johannesburg were born outside of Johannesburg and live in Johannesburg. So it's about the melting pot of bringing people together. And it had lots of stories around that. So the idea of what that message is a key component of nation building. Obviously, the aesthetic talks further, and it has a kind of deeper layer of what it means. And in the concourses of Soccer City, it was around tree structures and the root structures that that one finds in nature. Apologies. And then, of course, there's a massive history that goes with that particular stadium. It was when Nelson Mandela gave his first speech when he came out of prison, the burial of Chris Hani and Oliver Tambo, the winning of the African Nations Cup by South Africa. So all of those talk to those events that make a place very important, and obviously talk to memory and how people resonate and take ownership of a particular event. And of course, the FIFA World Cup was particularly important for the youth and creating a kind of future around sports and nation building for the future of the youth. And one will recall all these amazing scenes of jubilation in the streets, and people coming together and having the most amazing time. And probably one of the sporting events, the FIFA World Cup, that had the kind of least violence, because people just got together and had an amazing time in the stadium. And of course, the idea of inclusivity is hugely important, and the particular message around Soccer City was around how we include and bring people together from all the other stadiums that were part of that event. And the red line going just west of North was connecting to the journey that South Africa took to get to the World Cup, and that was from Germany, because we lost out to Germany previously. And of course, taking that further into mixed mode, the opportunity of massive concerts, and these are images of the U2 concert, the 360 tour that went around the world and obviously landed at Soccer City and brought a whole different crowd to the stadium. And of course talks to the sustainability of these large infrastructural investments, and talk to a kind of larger penetration in the
Apologies, I think we've just lost Bob for a moment. We're just going to wait for him to get back on. Bob, can you hear us? Apologies, everyone. I think Bob's just run into a technical issue. We're just going to wait a moment till he reconnects. Hi, Bob, are you there? Bob, you're on mute. I think you're on mute. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. I'm not sure why I'm getting feedback. Apologies.
Hi, James Kyle. We're just waiting. We're trying to get hold of Bob. We're just waiting for him to reconnect. I think he's just having an issue. So a moment or two, and we'll try get hold of him and then just get him back online. So please, apologies for that, and let's just wait a moment till he reconnects.
Okay, I think I'm in. Okay. Hi, can everyone hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Apologies, not sure what happened there. We'll try again. Can everyone see my screen?
We can't.
Can you see my screen?
No, we still can't.
Sure.
Perhaps if we're still struggling with that, maybe I don't know how much longer we had on the presentation, but I don't know if you want to continue with the panel, and whilst we wait with the presentation, or if you want to continue without it.
It looks like it's not allowing me to share. I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong. Apologies. So maybe we can try and continue. So maybe just as introductions, and apologies for the tech failure, but maybe I can introduce James Hamilton, Director at Turner & Townsend, as a co-panelist with his experience in Europe and the Middle East, and I think also in the US, with an opportunity to talk about his experience around these large sporting events. And we also have on the panel Carl Schofield. He's a director at QA Venue Solutions, who are particularly focused on the opportunities around the management and the commercialization of mixed mode sporting and events opportunities on the African continent. And so unfortunately I couldn't finish the presentation, but there were sort of three themes around the presentation that I was wanting to deal with. And the one is obviously large events, so the very large events like a FIFA World Cup or an Olympics, and the opportunity that brings for large infrastructure development and opportunities of creating mixed mode events and facilities for that, but also further creating infrastructure development in terms of rail and public transport, and of course hotels and the tourism around that. And maybe, James, I can bring you into the conversation here, trusting that the audio and everything is working. James, maybe you can give us an insight into the opportunities around what in our previous conversations we spoke about, this idea of storm chasing. And I'm quoting the term which you coined in an earlier conversation that we had around chasing the opportunity around these very large events. If you could talk briefly around that as an opportunity for infrastructure development.
James, I think you're on mute. James, we can't hear you.
We seem to have lost James completely. Kyle, can you hear us? And maybe we can bring you into the conversation.
Okay. Yes, I'm on.
So Kyle, I hope you followed our earlier conversation, my introduction to asking James around the question. So let's divert the question to yourself around the commercialization of various sporting events, and not only sporting events, kind of mixed mode events that talk to conferencing and all sorts of other events in mixed mode arena or sports cities.
Yeah, I think if we look at it across the board, we're starting to see a massive uptake in the whole sports tourism aspect across the continent, and that goes into business tourism, general eventing tourism, and what that does is it brings an entire congregation into the country or into countries, which is a prime opportunity to maximize, from a economy perspective and make some sort of impact in the economy. And with that, where we see a key opportunity coming in is with the venues that host a lot of these major institutions, is how those venues are commercialized, how they are live beyond the event that it's been built for, so that it can create a circular economy built to sustain itself for the next big event that comes into the city. And we're not having to then rebuild every single time to accommodate eventing. And I think over time, what we'll start to see, and specifically for the African continent, is that our initial investment is then a lot more in terms of return of investment, based on the fact that we get to then spread this cost over a number of different major events that take place. So to speak to the development side of it and what that brings to the economy in terms of specifically commercialization, is that ability to continuously host in the same venue and really not have to rebuild or reinvest.
So Kyle, how important do you feel it is to co-locate a venue? We're assuming that the venue is mixed mode, and how important is it from a capacity point of view to co-locate this with either other sporting facilities or other mixed-use facilities around the venue?
Yeah, it's extremely important. I think one of the key aspects that we're seeing as we go across the continent is a management factor being something that either makes or breaks the operation. And where we're starting to see the gap open up is the ability to co-locate, like you say, with an arena, for instance, right next to a stadium. You then start to pull that management over two entities and not have to bear the cost of two separate management systems to run a venue. And I think if we're really trying to bring the standard of infrastructure and eventing general sports tourism on the continent up to a level where it can compete globally, we really need to streamline from an operation perspective and make sure that, you know, our overheads and our continuous running of these venues is something that matches the market and the ability for the market to spend. You know, if we look at that, that's a key component to the success of these businesses. So being able to co-locate, co-manage, and keep everything in space, create that heartbeat in one space that then you know, pulsates into the rest of the economy, is something from a long-term perspective is extremely important.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm just checking in. James, are you able to connect with us? Are you with us? And seems like we've still lost James. We still can't hear you, unfortunately. Still struggling, James. I'm going to carry on with Kyle. So Kyle, the co-location, we talk about co-location of a kind of mixed mode arena opportunity next door to a stadium, and I assume that a stadium anywhere from say 10,000 seats up to the mega stadiums of around 80,000. That co-location is obviously an opportunity for saving costs and making sure that there is more of a 24/7 opportunity around the utilization of that of the sports precinct. But over and above the co-location of of other sporting events, there's also the co-location of a mixed-use arena in a kind of high-density area, either close to commercial opportunities or close to public transport opportunities, which makes sense from an accessibility point of view, and turning an arena or a sports precinct into something that lives longer than just the few hours of an event.
Yeah, definitely. You know, if we look at it, a lot of the stuff that we've been doing on the continent, and I think to sort of put it into perspective as to why we speak of this co-location of entities, is if you look at a major stadium, for instance, 80,000 seater, your programming on that arena, on that stadium, is at max, you know, 15 to 20 events over the year period, which is definitely not enough to sustain the building to the level that you need it at, so that you don't have to consistently refurbish. Adding that arena component next to it, that's an entity that you can program, you know, 150 times over in a year with different events, really bringing in that multi-purpose element of the space. So what that does immediately is it creates a cash cow that then can sustain both elements. That's one component of it. The other metric that you really need to look at is the amount of people that this draws into the arena space. And, you know, if you're talking 150 events in a year, with an average attendance of 5,000 plus, you really start to bring a considerable amount of people into one space. And what that offers is, again, you know, that heartbeat to then create commercial properties around it, and we're seeing a trend across the globe of people developing, you know, retail spaces, mini shopping malls, office spaces around arenas, purely based on the fact that there's thousands of people being driven into that space for various events, you know, trade shows, expos, so forth. So if we look at that, we look at those two key metrics, and we look at the continent as a whole and what's happening. You know, we're seeing the development of new cities taking place, and a key component of those cities actually working is how people get into that city, what people do in the city, and how you retain people in that city. And we, definitely feel from an arena perspective and multi-purpose, multi-use infrastructure, you start to tick those boxes where you can really bring people into the space, retain people in that space, and start to create a circular economy that goes beyond just what you're doing in the arena itself.
Thanks, Carl. So if one looks at again with the theme of co-location in terms of existing facilities, so all over the continent we see many stadiums that have been built kind of as national stadiums. Often they sit in areas that haven't seen further development. The stadium is probably well located. They might be struggling with public transport, which is a common theme across the continent, and the management of the stadium and the looking after of that existing facility. So there is obviously then an opportunity for us to then create another facility that's adjacent to an existing facility, and then hopefully create a kind of spin-off for further events and further investment in public transport, and then potentially, if the area is correct and accessible, into commercial development. So is that potentially an opportunity for yourselves to be looking at these various existing facilities that might need some commercialization, and an opportunity to bring in some other kind of sporting codes?
Yes, definitely. And I think if we, again, looking across the continent, there's a multitude of venues that have been built that sit at the moment not being commercialized the way they should be. And if we are able to bring that into the picture, it really starts to change what's happening in that space. But as a first component, and speaking to what we are doing on the continent, is really creating the model. I think if we look across various platforms, you won't really find information dedicated to what's happening in these multi-use venues, where you can structurally put out a model in front of various banks and say, this is what you're potentially getting off having an arena in your space. So for us, that's the first step, is let's get into the space. Let's look at how best we commercialize it based on what the market requires, so that we can go in front of property developers, banking institutions, general retailers, and say, this is based on metrics that we have at our disposal. We are pulling 500,000 plus people over a certain period of time, and based on that, we think it's justifiable to bring in a office building. It's justifiable to bring in retail spaces, and so forth. So I think that's really first step is capturing the data, so that we can then speak to every element that you've brought up in terms of bringing in new sporting events, bringing in new aspects to that arena, and then the cherry on top being the fact that commercializing a place is really based on the metrics that are at play. How many people are in the space is a major metric. What's the sort of exposure of this place is a big metric that we need to justify, and that's really the starting ground, is getting that piece across so we can speak to the rest of it.
Carl, thanks. I'm just going to see if James can connect with us again. He seems to be with us. James, are you with us? James? Possibly not. So, Carl, we've spoken about existing facilities, co-locating with a new facility. James, are you with us? Can you see us and can you hear us? Still struggling. So
James,
Carl,
you're on mute.
James?
We can see that your mic is muted from our side. If you can just check that, James.
Okay. So Carl, just to keep the conversation rolling, is there's obviously then opportunity for the insertion of sporting infrastructure into existing commercial developments, into high-density commercial developments or areas in a city where there is no infrastructure for sports or eventing, but there might be good commercial infrastructure, there might be good public transport infrastructure. Talk to us about the opportunity of inserting our sports opportunity into a high-density commercial environment.
Yeah, definitely. If you look at any sort of major sporting event, it's not really just the event that comes into the market and that specific sporting event. What generally happens is you've got a ripple effect of a number of different events that take place. And that build-up is almost a week and a half prior to the main activity happening. So for an entire week and a half, you've got all this economic activity taking place. And if you look at Rwanda, for instance, where we're currently managing the Kigali Arena, metrics in terms of people coming into the country, average spend per person is sitting at roughly $280. And if you multiply that by the amount of people that come into the country, it's exponential in terms of the amount of money that enters the country. Now you take that group of people and you place them in the designated area where this event's going to take place, and you can imagine the economic impact that happens around that. It's additional venues being taken up, it's additional hotels being used, general retail spaces taking advantage of the people in that space, and so that continues to grow. So if you look number again of people in the space, it really starts to justify positioning a venue or entity that can host major sporting events right in the middle of a high density area. I think there's two approaches to it. If we take ourselves on the continent and we place this on the table, majority of the time they're going to say, let's move it slightly out of the high density areas just to spread the population a bit. But if we look at some of the more established markets, US and Europe, their game plan is really being in those high density areas because the infrastructure around it can handle it. And with that, the economic impact is felt because your people, firstly, are based there, so it's very easy for them to access the space. And then on top of that, you're bringing people from the outside into the event space. So based on that, you can really see that impact. And if you really quickly add up the numbers of people that come in, it's a significant.
So Carl, let's assume we have some infrastructure somewhere and we've co-located it either with other sports facilities or we've co-located it with some commercial opportunity and maybe there's some good infrastructure. There's the opportunity of chasing that event, and that's what I wanted to start discussing with James, but we're still battling to connect with him. But the point of and I'm going to use James's term, which is the idea of storm chasing. So the idea of understanding when these events take place. There's always a kind of calendar around these events, and the way that they happen every 2 years, every 4 years, every 3 years, every 5 years, depending on which event it is. And there's this opportunity to chase those kind of larger events, which obviously require massive infrastructure spend and huge government backing. And I see James is maybe back. So maybe, James, we can see you. Can we hear you?
Good. Can you hear me this time?
We can hear you this time. Fantastic. So James, I want to...
Okay.
Great.
Yeah, Bob, thank you. And apologies if you couldn't hear me before. So yeah, following the track and the train of thought there. And the idea of storm chasing. So really what that is about is recognizing where the infrastructure flows start to come from. And it might be 15 to 20 years out from actually hosting the big event, such as a FIFA World Cup or an Olympics, predominantly the Summer Olympics. And I think, these major events are the pinnacle for a lot of nations to try and achieve, because they really achieve a significant milestone. But quite often what they are just a milestone on the track towards a much bigger vision which is being set. So quite often you will find that a 20 to 30 year vision will be set by a nation, and that's all about this nation building exercise that goes on. And the importance of the event is obviously historic in that way, but the really important part of it is what the legacy is going to be and how that legacy can be continued. And there are obviously some classic examples of where it's been done well and it hasn't been done so well on the opposite. So the likes of, for example, London 2012 with the Olympics was one of those classic events which was held out to be exceptionally strong for creating a legacy. It was very much part of a regeneration of the east part of London, and it regenerated that area, and it created quite a powerful effect. And in terms of economic spend and inward investment, in dollar terms, is probably equal to about $15 to $20 billion worth of incoming investment into the UK, all around the power of that event. And what that did was it set that part of London up for future regeneration and inward investment as well. So it's been very powerful. Potentially on the downside of that is that those in the other parts of the UK may argue that the ripple effect didn't happen wide enough and that it was quite centralised towards London. I think nations have to try and achieve this balance where they are, looking to how they can create a far more wider ranging effect across the whole of the country to extend the power of that nation. But if you look at Brazil, which was in 2014 with the FIFA World Cup, and then they had the Olympics as well, the effect of both of those major events has been a little bit more hard-reaching, really, on their economy. It's actually had more of a negative effect, and that's been something that I think both FIFA and the International Organising Committee for the Olympic Committee have really taken note of the fact that these major events can have quite a damaging effect if they're not handled correctly. And there's more of a shared ownership on this now going forward, and I think that's really important. So as we kind of look forward to where we are now and where I sit right now in Birmingham, which is set to host the 2022 Commonwealth Games, there's much more of a kind of a shared ownership around legacy and making sure that all the investments that are going into a city and to and being extended by a nation's government are actually used to a really more powerful effect. And also the whole concept around minimizing cost, only doing things that have to be done necessarily, trying to utilize existing venues as much as possible, working on new solutions for temporary overlay and stadiums and venues that can pop up and down and can be also reutilized and sent abroad if necessary again to be reused for other countries who are hosting events as well. So I think this whole tranche of continued investment is now seen by the major federations as being something that they have to take a lot more balanced approach about. And when we are storm chasing, it's not just seen to be for the good of others to benefit, or it has to be seen for something that's going to create a lasting effect for everybody, particularly on the ground.
Yeah. So James, can I come in there and just prompt you on the idea of storm chasing? So obviously one doesn't need to go for the biggest storm, which is either a FIFA World Cup or an Olympics. There are these stepping stones that you reference around smaller events to slowly build around a vision which might eventually be to go for the big opportunities. So there are kind of regional events, sporting events, and concerts of things like that could start the country or the city on a journey of a 20-year vision, build one facility, start hosting a few smaller events, bid for a regional event like an African Youth Olympics or the All Africa Games or an African Nations Cup or something like that, so that they are used as these stepping stones, so that the infrastructure doesn't all have to happen in one foul swoop. Talk to us about that as a
Very much, I
principle.
think. I mean, you know, one of my other sort of significant experiences has been on the next FIFA World Cup, which is in Qatar in 2022, and they, you know, Qatar is a very, very small nation, and they have very little in the way, or had very little in the way of both sporting infrastructure and real hard infrastructure in terms of, you know, really strong international airport, port, roads infrastructure, utilities, etc. And it was really down to a vision which was set at the end of the 1990s by the incoming emir, who wanted to put that nation on the map. Now, quite clearly, they had a large amount of resource to enable them to do that in terms of oil and gas to provide the finance and the funding. But they also realised that, you know, to get to where they wanted to get to, they had to go through these stepping stones, as you rightly say, Paul. And the first major stepping stone that they went for was the Asian Games in 2006, and that was quite a hard ask for a very small country without that sporting infrastructure there to do. And but they did it and they achieved it. But what they put in behind that was this sort of legacy that you will see that comes out of the 2022 World Cup when it happens. And one of those was investing in a really, really top-class sporting academy called Aspire. And Aspire is actually, it's a boarding school for young kids. They take a tranche every year for the local population, and they take them at an early age, and that's where they go to school and they train, and they train them specifically in a chosen sport, which they will therefore then be an elite at when they finish school. And what's happening there, and what has happened there, is that they've actually now become quite a powerful nation in football already, and you know, having won the Gulf Cup just last year, you know, they've actually proved that they can be on the world stage. Now, not many people would actually really said that would ever happen, but it has happened. So stepping stones along the way, absolutely right. And similar things that happen, you know, all around the world. You know, another example I think is possibly in India, where Delhi hosted the 2010 Commonwealth Games, which, you know, had its issues, particularly around athletes' accommodation, and I think India has very much taken that to heart and said that they want to make good about that, and they want to prove that they actually can host a bigger event in the future, like an Olympics, and are really, really heavily investing now in infrastructure to support that. But it's not just hard infrastructure; it's also social infrastructure, which we've also talked about, Bob. And I think that social infrastructure bit is really, really important to go along with the hard infrastructure. So investing in the benefits that can come out of, you know, these kind of events by creating other employment opportunities, by upskilling the workforce in the nation, by creating a kind of a healthy approach to living and well-being, and improving mental awareness all the way through as well, I think is really key. So there's a number of things that start to happen along this kind of 15 to 20 year process and plan that eventually ends up in this really good place. And you know, I think it's terrific that, you know, that countries and cities are brave enough still to want to go for it. And long may that be the case, because it really is, you know, a significant stimulus to take it to the next step, providing it's done in a really good way.
So James, to broaden their thinking on the stepping stones is obviously the investment in not just only sports and infrastructure, but in things like social investment in arts and culture, and other facilities, and obviously commerce and industry. So it's a multi-pronged approach. It's not just about sport or not just about eventing. There's the whole investment across the board in agriculture and everything are all sorts of stepping stones to a kind of much broader vision, and ultimately wanting to kind of eventually get to a FIFA or an Olympics. So the point I just wanted to make there, that there are so many other stepping stones outside of the kind of the sport as nation building. I want to. Sorry, James.
That's great. Yeah, Bob, I agree. It's a platform, effectively, is what you're trying to create, which has probably got 4 or 5 key pillars attached to it: the social, the cultural, the sporting, and of course the hard economic platforms that go with it. And providing there's a balanced approach to all of those, then I think you end up in a good place. If you overemphasize one of them or the other, and forget the other, then that's where I think the imbalance starts to occur. And the really key thing is making sure that there's an eye on the 10-year program, which is beyond that event, so that you don't lose track of that, and that all the investment is actually really about well beyond that historic event.
So I'd like to, thanks James, I'd like to have just chat about the idea of temporary structures, and this is also for Kyle. The title of our talk is Sports as Nation Building, and one of the big things about nation building is obviously we want to get the biggest and the best as soon as possible. But again, a kind of stepping stone is that you build a smaller facility which can grow in a temporary nature to, say, for example, you build a 20,000-seater stadium, and you then grow temporary to get to the minimum 45 that you need for a FIFA World Cup event, or in fact you do temporary structures to host larger concerts or things like that. So Kyle, talk to us from a management point of view and a commercialization of temporary facilities to attract events to a city or to a country.
Yeah, look, from a temporary infrastructure standpoint, I think there's various aspects to look at from that. Specifically, taking the continent into account, is we look at a lot of investment going into infrastructure. If we can find a way of perfecting the model of temporary infrastructure, it puts us in a far better position to host a lot of these major events. And sort of build up to the larger scale, as you say. If we're taking it to Rwanda again, which I think is a perfect example of what we're discussing now, where the country has systematically built itself up to a point where they're sitting with a 10,000-seater arena at the moment, and have a real vision of commercializing that place. They've built up from a significantly smaller venues, and to a certain degree, you can label them temporary structures that have then gone into a solid 3,000-4,000 seater arena, and have now developed the 10,000 seater arena, which now opens them up to large scale events, large basketball events, indoor concerts, and so forth. So that temporary structure or temporary infrastructure that comes into play is extremely critical to developing and not sort of overdoing the build, where you find yourself in a position where the economy has not met your drive in terms of infrastructure build. It's systematic, where economy builds. And we see it a lot across the continent, where the economies in the continent need to take that step-by-step approach. They need to focus on things like the agriculture. They need to focus on general infrastructure. Education in the markets are key, so that they can then position themselves and say, how do we focus on regional and international integration into the country, but also not putting ourselves in a position where we can't handle the influx of people, we can't handle the influx of general sort of financial systems in the market. So that step-by-step approach, with the temporary infrastructure is critical, and plays a vital role of getting yourself to a point where you can host large-scale events and make the most of them. Create the infrastructure around it so that you can maximize every touch point. And someone coming into the market is not just focused on one entity, spends in that space, and then leaves the country. It needs to impact on the general transportation. It needs to impact on the general hospitality, and to a further extent, property investment and so forth. If we look at Senegal as an example, Senegal went through a process. They now are developing their new city, Diamniadio, and a critical piece of the development in the new city is the Dakar Arena. And that arena is also positioned to bring as many people into the space. They've coupled that with a conference center and a hotel, all with the idea of how do we bring people into that space. What it's also driven in terms of an investment is the railway line that now feeds from the main city, Dakar, through Diamniadio and into the newly built airport. So it all plays a role in not only from a general multi-use investment perspective, but also then branches off into other aspects of the economy and drives that investment to a certain degree.
So, James, you would have seen various temporary structures and systems that are on the market, and in some cases kind of containerized. That there can be something that is kind of built, used for an event over a 4 or a 6 week period, and then kind of disassembled and almost shipped out of town to either outlying towns or maybe to other countries as a means of kind of distributing that investment to a broader audience. Maybe you have 1 or 2 examples you might want to highlight for us.
Yeah, sure. I mean, sorry.
We lost James. So then maybe I'll talk to that. In Qatar, apparently there is this opportunity that they have, that they've basically got a large stadium. It's completely containerized, and the intention is to kind of pack it up, put it back in containers, split it up, and send it out to various other outlying cities. So the idea is that can actually be a sort of temporary venue. Some of it can remain in place for the legacy, and then it can be shipped out, and more people in the broader community can get the benefit of it. Because not everything from an investment point of view has to be something that remains in place from a legacy point of view. So Kyle, maybe we can talk about legacy as a kind of important key component of these large sporting events. And we often see that there is often kind of overinvestment in the facilities because they are asked for in the kind of guideline book. But we've seen now the kind of softening stance from the larger FIFAs and Olympic committees to talk about affordability, so that we understand what legacy is required. A good example would be, the city needs a 20,000 seater stadium, but to host a large event, you need minimum 40 or 45,000 seats. So that's quite key. So talk to us from a legacy point of view, that the understanding of what's required, and again touching into the principles of stepping stones, so that we don't have to build everything all in one shot.
I think this is good reference to we had discussed yesterday, and I think James had mentioned it, where even in Qatar they're looking at building an infrastructure that can build up to 40,000 seaters, and when that's done, bring it back down to 20,000 seats. That's a model that definitely, I think, from a legacy building perspective and maintaining operations, is you then have of both worlds, where you can host a major event or anything of that sort, and then bring that back down to economies where so those sort of
Carl, you're dropping off. Kyle, seems like we're having sound issues or connectivity issues with Kyle. He's sitting in Rwanda at the moment. James is in Birmingham. We're also struggling. I trust that that many of you can still hear myself. So I'm going to try and keep this going for a couple more minutes. James is back online, it looks like. James, can you? Yeah, we can hear you. We've lost you again. Let's see if we can just get either James or Carl back online. So if you could just bear with us. Here we go. James, you back?
I hope so.
Yes, we can see you and we can hear you.
Right, great. Let's try again. So I think we're talking about temporary structures and
yes, and the principle of legacy.
Yeah. So I think again, a lot of this was born out of London 2012, where a lot of the venues that were utilised there were temporary structures, and they really sort of set a bit of a precedent going forward. So when we got to 2022 and we started planning and designing for 2022 FIFA World Cup in around 2012, just off the back of the London 2012 Olympics, a lot of the knowledge and the expertise was transferred from there into the program. So again, it's sort of a 10 to 12 year look ahead. And when we started writing design briefs, we actually wrote into the design briefs that all of the stadia had to be modularized and built with temporary structures. What that meant was for principally the stadiums which were going to be utilised for group stages, where the minimum capacity requirement was 45,000 seats net, we were basically asking for a legacy proposition for around about 20,000, so that effectively you design a stadium where only half of it was going to be utilised for the actual tournament, the championships itself, and then straight afterwards it can be half of the stadium can be demounted, and it brings it back to an acceptable size to meet the needs of the host city and the nation post the game. So there's a lot of design thought that went into that to actually enable that to happen. And one of the commitments that was made by Qatar during this bid and its hosting agreement was that it would provide to 22 developing nations what would be the output of those demounted stadiums. So they would take them down, and then there would be a significant number of seats and terraces and tiers which would be able to be shipped off to developing countries to enable them to host future events. As time went on, we also started to develop into the concept of actually being able to develop a stadium which would be completely flat packed. So you actually take it from the factory, put it into a shipping container, send it halfway around the world, unpack it, take it all out of the shipping container, start building it up, and then actually utilize the shipping containers themselves to be part of the structure and the frame of the stadium, so it becomes integral, and all of them converted into suites. You host the championships, you play the games, and then you mount it all back into a shipping container, and then you pack it back off on the ship. And that's incredible, when you think what that means, and the intensity of the design process to enable that to happen. But the future legacy is absolutely enormous in terms of what we can create. So I think, for sure, what these major championships also do is that they drive innovation to an extraordinary length. and the best minds and the best ideas start to come out in this period of time. And I think again that's something that a lot of people miss when they see the event, is they don't actually recognise that there's been a significant amount of thought leadership that's gone into this to actually stage such an amazing event.
Thanks, James. The sound isn't perfect, but I'm going to continue. The idea of driving innovation and design thinking around all of these structures, around infrastructure spend. Obviously, there's the opportunity to get some amazing results, all of which need to be funded. And the primary source of these large events, from a funding point of view, is obviously national government, and in some cases local and provincial government. It's very seldom that the funding comes from a kind of a host club where they have a facility. So there's a large investment that needs to take place, and primarily on the African continent, we're seeing investment has to come from central government, and then the commercialization of these facilities through guys like Kyle and his team need to make sure that there's enough money coming into or enough events and generating enough income to look after these facilities, because these large sports infrastructure facilities need continued maintenance. Can you shed some light on the kind of investment, not quantum, but the principles around investment and the kind of multi-pronged approach to solving the investments around these large events?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. Can you hear me okay? Is the sound quality all right? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
You're absolutely right. It really is the biggest conundrum at the moment, is to how to fund them. And there are different models and principles that sit around them, and different countries, different nations take a different approach. Some, like Qatar, it's 100% state funded in that respect, in terms of the infrastructure that goes into it, but not every nation can do that. If you go to North America, to the US, it's much more about driving the power of the corporate investors to come into the whole scenario and to commercialize it much more, and it becomes much more of a shared ownership in that respect. But underlying everything, I think, is still that federal governments have to provide the bonding and the covenant to make sure that the tournament will be hosted, and that's what obviously the organising bodies and the federations are looking for, is that kind of guarantee. So it's quite significant, and you have to make sure that, say, federal governments and federal banks are sitting behind it. But I think the way forward is definitely much more of a shared attitude to this, and when corporate entities start to come into this and they see the benefits that can be gained from the power of sponsorship and commercial rights for TV, etc., then I think it creates a different attitude as well to getting things done, and that the private sector becomes much more engaged and much more involved. And again, that tends to enable you to drive a different level of innovation and investment from that point of view. And I think the other point about this is that the one thing that's absolutely unique to these events is the essence of criticality. So there is a hard deadline that is set by it. The ball has to be kicked off, or the opening ceremony has to happen on a certain date. There's no getting away from it, and therefore you have to make sure that everything in terms of resource, financial resource, educational resource, everything is powered towards achieving those particular deadlines. And what that does is it introduces a new level of project control. And what project control does is it hopefully enables you to maximise efficiencies around controlling expenditure, so that actually you're not spending a penny or a dollar unnecessarily in that respect. So I think financial control and project control is something that also is being really looked at. So the governance around controlling expenditure and funding was really quite key to everything going forward.
Thanks, James. I think on the item of criticality and timing, I think we've probably spent 5 minutes longer than we should have, given all the challenges we had with the tech on all sides. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you for your time and your contributions and your insights with your experience through the various events that you've been involved in. And I'd like to thank Carl in his absence for his contribution and insights from a management and a commercialization point of view. And then also thank API for the opportunity to create the platform for us to have this conversation and to share some of the insights that we have had through our shared experiences with these larger events, and the idea of bringing a nation building around sports and sports infrastructure investment into either sports cities or sports precincts within mixed use developments, I think is a huge opportunity across the African continent. And so once again, thank you, and have a good day and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bob.